Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. In this video I'll be discussing and analyzing Ian Fleming's 10th James Bond novel, The Spy Who Loved Me, which was released by Jonathan Cape in 1962 and was the last Bond novel to be released before the start of the Eon film series, or at least it was the last book to come out before the release of the film version of Dr. No that same year. Spy as a book had a, shall we say, less than stellar critical reception on its original release, and it was an experiment by Fleming to do something different and challenge himself. It is an atypical novel for the series because James Bond only appears in the third act of an already shorter book, and the entire book is in the viewpoint of the woman of the story, Vivian Michel, known as Viv for short. So it is a complete departure and experiment, which also draws on certain aspects of the For Your Eyes Only short story collection and other aspects of Fleming's writing where he occasionally tried to do other things, and it all comes together in this one book where it's very obvious he had felt he was going a bit stale, and I think he decided to do something this bold after the whole Thunderball saga had fallen apart with the film adaptation not getting off the ground, and then Fleming turning the surviving story treatments and drafts and other materials by himself, Kevin McClory, and Jack Whittingham into his 9th James Bond novel, which had been Thunderball, published the year before in 1961, and there was the big blow-up with McClory, which led to the court case over the authorship and credits of the book. So I think that, along with Fleming's increasingly ill health and the ups and downs in his personal life at the time, I think all of that feeds into the book. And I think you do have to look at the spy novel with at least some of that in mind to get the fullest experience, as there is something to be said about how the book isn't just a departure, but it also is much more simple in a lot of the areas that are larger than life or extremely inventive in Fleming's typical James Bond writing style. Fleming is never boring, but The Spy Who Loved Me as a book is arguably his most direct and straightforward book. And that's because it is not from the perspective of James Bond, nor is Fleming really writing in his author's voice directly. He's doing it all through the eyes of a young French-Canadian woman, Viv Michel, in her early 20s, and it is unbelievably striking that he even attempted to do such a thing. So anyone reading the books, or any James Bond fan coming to The Spy Who Loved Me, immediately has to get over that hurdle of this being an experimental novel that not only is from the woman's perspective, but James Bond does not appear until the last act of the book, and the plot itself is very perfunctory because it's a very small story in a central area. And really, the first act of the book is a character piece about Viv's backstory, and then the second act is where we start to layer in the suspense with the introduction of 2 new characters, and then Act 3 is Bond appearing, and it's very obvious where the story is going to go. He's there to be the real-life St. George and slay the dragon to rescue the fair maiden. It's very cut and dry, but it's not without its merit, because the book, I think, is actually very important for understanding not just where Fleming's head was at the time, but also understanding where the James Bond character was at the time, because this book has to be examined as the connection, the bridge between Thunderball and On Her Majesty's Secret Service in terms of the Bond character and the ever-growing sense of malaise and being older and tired and worn down by the rigors of his job and killing people and just becoming increasingly tired with the whole game of espionage and spycraft, and how this wears away at a person. So you don't get a lot of that, but you get enough of it here. This is essentially a little snapshot of where James Bond was at a particular place in time, and even how he comes to enter into the story, because he's been wrapping up an unrelated small incident between big missions replicated in the novels. The Spy Who Loved Me is often described as a failed experiment. I do think that's unfair, because it is a good book. It is a well-written book, and Fleming couldn't be boring if he tried to, And it is an absolutely remarkable achievement, with one exception, I would say, how well Fleming is able to write from the female perspective. I do think he does not get the credit he deserves for the strength of his female heroines in each of the Bond novels. And this is the one time where he doesn't just go into the woman's head and give her internal monologue for certain sections or give her a backstory, but does it for the entire book. And the whole first act is Vivian reflecting on how she came to be managing the Dreamy Pines motor court near the Adirondacks in northern upstate New York for a particular time. And the whole first act is Viv essentially reflecting on how she got to where she is and the various ups and downs in her life. So it is, I think, again, with the exception of one line in particular, which we'll get to, and anyone who's read the book, I'm sure, is aware of what line I'm referring to. I think it's actually rather astonishing how well Fleming, for an Englishman in the 1960s of a particular age, is able to write from the woman's perspective. I think it is quite good throughout, and the whole first act section of Vivian's recollections about her youth and how she came to be in England and always being an outsider because she was Canadian, trying to fit in with the British class system, and then her first two relationships with two different men, each deeply wounding her in different ways, so she becomes the ultimate example, at least before Tracy and OHMSS, of Fleming's favorite type of characterization for one of his heroines, the bird with a wing down, which is actually name-checked here in the book. It's specifically stated that is what she is. And so over the course of the book, you realize that, as it said, things always come in threes. So she has not one, but two terrible, extremely emotionally and physically devastating love affairs, shall we say. And then her plight in the book and encountering James Bond is the third crisis in her life. And so if she can come through unscathed, then she will hopefully be a stronger person for it. So to talk about the plot, Vivian is really the subject of the entire book. Yes, it's a James Bond novel, but it's really the heroine's novel for the first and only time. James Bond is who leads the action in the third act of the book, but if you examine the structure, he is more of the heroic character who enters in the final act and sets things right after a struggle. So he's the dashing heroic figure, yes. He's a bit cruel by nature, yes, but he's not the primary character. The primary character is Vivian. The book is split into three acts that are each named. So the first is entitled Me, which is Vivian telling the reader how she got to be managing the Dreamy Pines Motor Court, a small motel in upstate New York near the Canadian border, also near the Adirondack Mountains. She is on a cross-country motor tour on her Vespa that she's bought after a absolutely devastating second love affair. And this is where she has essentially decided to try and find herself again. And so she dusts herself off, gets her little bit of money together, has already been let go from her job in the field of journalism, and has decided to just hit the road on her Vespa and become empowered in a way. And so while stopping over at this motel, she's been asked to manage it for the couple who run it, the Fancies. They're essentially closing down, and the motel is going to be shut down by its owner, Mr. Sanguinetti, and they needed somebody to essentially mind the store until he and his representatives showed up. And she needs the cash. So it's a very simple setup of getting this girl to an isolated location, and it's a motel. And if any of this has a tinge of Hitchcock's Psycho, I think that is because, at least in some instances, there was some inspiration that Fleming had in terms of having a beautiful young woman who's on the run from something in her past or some sort of guilt that she carries, being stuck at an isolated motel off the highway in the middle of nowhere, but in a very picturesque location, who will eventually be menaced by a certain figure. There are the parallels there. So I do think that Fleming obviously would have seen Psycho by this point, as he was a devoted Hitchcock fan. They had courted Hitchcock to direct the James Bond film they were working on during the Thunderball saga of development, and Fleming, of course, name-checks North by Northwest and the Thunderball novels. So I think it's very easy to draw connections and say that at least in some of the basic setup concept, that there was some Psycho influence. And this would be increased more when the book was actually published in a magazine in 1964 in abbreviated form under the title Motel Nymph. That's the thing. It was in Stag Magazine in 1964, and it's really playing up the lurid and pulpier side that the book is often thought to be, as most people just write it off as a failed experiment and too much like a Mickey Spillane story. That's usually the label you see attached to it. But that's, of course, referring to the second and third act, not the first act, and it's also doing the book a disservice. So the book being told from Vivian's perspective means that the reader is given full access to her history as she recounts it. It's basically a series of flashbacks that's mixed in with her at the hotel. So we get flashbacks to her buying the Vespa and shipping it over to North America. Of course, the start of her trip, getting to the motel, deciding to accept the job, and also as it gets closer to the time that the fancies are going to leave, they become increasingly nasty and hostile towards her for some reason, which of course starts this feeling of foreboding. And so on the night when she's managing the motel and there's this raging storm outside and she's a little bit on edge just at the weather and being where she is, she's essentially going back into her past and reflecting on how she got there, and also, how did things go so wrong? And of course, after a few drinks, starts digging into her painful experiences, which are the primary reason why she's gone on this journey of self-discovery. This section, I would say, is the Fleming of Quantum of Solace, as this is where there's no sign of the world of spies. This is completely alien to the world of James Bond. It is the Fleming of Quantum of Solace, where in that short story he wrote about the disintegration of not just a marriage, but the relationship and general human qualities between two people. That is the ultimate sign of how good Fleming was as a writer outside of the world of James Bond. Here in the first act of Spy, it's the other time that Fleming really tries to do that, and it's all from the female perspective. So that's what gives it a completely different style and feel, as you're hearing her internal monologue recounting her own story, a story that she's already experienced and lived through, and so she's going through all this pain all over again, essentially. So the reader gets to hear about her childhood, how she came to England and never really fit in. She always felt like an outsider. She always felt like she had to be the proper young lady, and it's extremely well realized. It's striking because you actually forget that this is Fleming writing this. You get so swept up into the characterization and this girl recounting her life story and hearing her internal monologue. And you have to wonder how Fleming could actually do this so vividly and make it feel genuine, because he does. And I think the answer to that is in Fleming's own history, and this has gone into in some of the biographies, particularly Andrew Lycett's biography. But Fleming apparently did mine from his own history in terms of certain elements and things that are worked into Vivian's backstory. It's not that he rewrote his own life story as a fictional character, but there are certain elements that I think he drew on and used that to make them feel completely realized, just obviously from a different person's perspective. So there's never a sense of it being a man writing a female character in this first act, and I think that gets the book off to a very good start. But you do have to keep in mind, if you come to this for a James Bond experience, and this is where I think most Bond fans sort of lose interest, is that you're not going to get James Bond until the third act of three. So you have to keep in mind the first act is to make you really fall in love with the Vivian character and feel for her, feel sympathy for her, and understand where she is at emotionally, physically, and mentally. Because we also see her meet her first love interest, Derek, who she has a relationship with, and he's a young, more well-to-do fellow who's about to go off to university, and they have wonderful times together, going around everywhere. And finally, he, of course, wants to consummate the relationship. And Vivian eventually goes along with it and trying to essentially be a good sport, as it's said, even though she has great misgivings about it, as she is still a virgin at this point. And Derek shows his true colors of sorts as he tries first to do the deed, as it were, in a theater or cinema, and that doesn't go so well, which humiliates Vivian. And if that were not enough to show how much of a not pleasant person this Derek was, he decides, I suppose, to not waste the evening and convinces Vivian to just have at it in a field. And she describes how it was an incredibly humiliating, demeaning, and unpleasant experience, particularly for her first time, and then she's essentially ghosted. So that is the first of the major turmoils in her life that have led to where she is in the book. And again, it's astonishing how detailed and vivid and believable all of this is, and how it's recounted, and how things start to build, and the reader can very clearly see where these things are starting to go. And that even in the first act, where it's just flashbacks to the backstory, you get little tinges of suspense, because you're several steps ahead, because at this point the character was younger and not as experienced in the ways of the world. Vivian is able to eventually get a career in journalism, and that's where she meets her second partner, Kurt, a German who is a reporter and journalist who's working for a German news service as their London representative, and Vivian is an incredibly gifted office employee and a fellow co-worker, and essentially they eventually become lovers. The difference with Kurt is that he is very strict and rigid in his own sort of rules and ways of living life that he has devised, because that's just apparently his thing. And while Vivian has certain feelings for him, it's really a relationship for the both of them that has arisen out of convenience, and she is in some ways unable to fully say whether she truly loves this man or not. This relationship continues until Vivian reveals that she has become pregnant, at which her partner also reveals his true colors and gives her some money, sends her off to have an abortion, and wants nothing else to do with her. That's essentially it. And so after that unbelievably dramatic and harrowing experience, and then actually going and getting the abortion, that's where essentially Vivian finds herself and decides to start this journey, and just goes and decides she's going to buy a Vespa and drive across the US, because that's just what she's going to do. It's something she has to do. She's going to sell everything. She's going to drive off. Maybe she'll never come back. Who knows? So that's where she's actually starting the book. But the whole first act gives the reader these elements in the backstory in pieces, and it's done through flashbacks as the character's remembering, so they are actually done through the guise of individual memories, and they get fragmented by jumping back to the present, where something shakes Vivian out of her recollections, or she pours another drink, or at one point she gets a little spooked and goes to turn on the vacancy sign and gets electrocuted, because she hadn't had enough problems in her life. But of course, those problems are going to go stratospheric in the second act. The first act is really used to make the reader fall in love with Viv as a character, to feel for her, to obviously develop sympathy for her, so that when the danger really comes in Act 2, that's what sets off the suspense. And with Act 1 setting up the reader's connection to the lead character, the reader is then made to feel and worry for the character much more than had it just been a story that started with the threat and not had the build-up and the backstory to make the reader care about the character. Now, I just want to highlight something in the first act, and that's actually the opening line, which is another of Fleming's masterful, all-time great opening lines, but also it runs into the whole opening paragraph, because you've got the opening line, and then the opening paragraph continues this idea, but it is, I think, evocative of everything the book is trying to do. I think it gives you the entire character in a single opening paragraph, and the opening line is unbelievably arresting. It's, of course, very simple. It's just 4 words, but it's got that immediate charge that only a Fleming opening line has. And for me, this is another of the great opening lines and opening paragraphs in literature. I was running away. I was running away from England, from my childhood, from the winter, from a sequence of untidy, unattractive love affairs, from a few sticks of furniture and jumble of overworn clothes that my London life had collected around me, and I was running away from the drabness, fustiness, snobbery, the claustrophobia of close horizons, and from my inability, although I am quite an attractive rat, to make headway in the rat race. In fact, I was running away from almost everything except the law. That opening paragraph right there tells you everything about Vivian Michel as a character, and also you feel Fleming's own outlook on life throughout every single word of that. That opener, I think, will hook most any reader, and I think Bond fans just need to understand coming to this book that it is experimental, and it's much more in line with the experimental short stories like Quantum of Solace, so just don't expect to have a traditional James Bond adventure when you're going into this. Act 2 is entitled Them. This is where the danger comes into the story, as at the lonely Dreamy Pines Motor Court, suddenly 2 men arrive who are there to menace young Viv. They are the pair of, obviously, killers, Horror and Slugsy. They are the representatives of the motel's owner, Mr. Sanguinetti. As soon as they come across the threshold and they enter the motel, they drop all pretenses and are very obviously 2 hoods. So they have the very heavy gangster lingo dialogue that Fleming loves so much. And so they seem like they're right out of the Diamonds Are Forever novel. In fact, they do seem quite similar to the pair of killers, Wint and Kidd, except here these 2 are much more in your face in terms of how nasty and stereotypically gangster they are in their actions and dialogue. So they just immediately start menacing Vivian, who does actually try to defend herself where possible, and she knows this is obviously not going to end well for her, but she has to try and figure out exactly what they're there for. They claim to be there for Mr. Sanguinetti to help watch the motel until he shows up to close it down, but over the course of the book, it's revealed that they're there to just make a mess and help Sanguinetti carry off a case of insurance fraud. And Viv has essentially been decided to be the fall woman instead of the fall guy. And the whole of the motel burning down will be blamed on her, and Sanguinetti will just get away with the insurance money. But that's really not even important to the plot of the book, because the plot of the book is, will this poor girl actually survive, because these 2 gangsters have shown up, and they're there to have their way and threaten, of course, rape and assault and even worse. And it's very clear that these are 2 killers who are there to kill her for some reason. Horror is described as very tall and thin, and having very sharp teeth that have been capped with steel. That, of course, is one of the only elements that would get lifted for the film of the same name. Slugsy is his shorter, bald, round-headed companion who is much more direct in his communications and his desires for Vivian. Both are obviously hired killers and love what they do, but it is very obvious that Horror is the more dangerous of the two. And should his anger get riled, then it's obviously going to be even worse for poor Viv than what Slugsy could do to her. So Act 2 is their arrival and the menacing of Vivian and how tensions constantly flare up and come back down, and Fleming uses bits of reality to bring the tension down, but constantly keep the suspense at a certain level. So Viv goes through the motions. She even cooks for them, makes them some scrambled eggs. And of course, it's Fleming. It's going to be scrambled eggs, as he was a connoisseur of the scrambled egg, though I can't blame him because I love scrambled eggs too. But throughout Act 2, Vivian does try to get away and make escape attempts or defend herself, and even manages to draw blood at points. So she's no mere damsel in distress, but she is obviously in over her head, and this is a world that she has never experienced. So things are not looking too good for her when Act 3 starts, because there's suddenly, at the right exact moment, essentially the 11th hour, where it's going to be absolute doom for our heroine. The doorbell rings at the front, or the buzzer at the front of the motel, and who should be on the doorstep but one James Bond who had just had a puncture down the road, and the vacancy sign was on. So this is what leads us into Act 3, which is, of course, entitled Him, which, of course, is referring to Bond himself. Bond enters in this final act, gets the lay of the land, finds out what the situation is, and Viv fills Bond in while she can, talking under her breath and trying to quietly let him know that these killers are here. She doesn't know what exactly they're after, and he's essentially got to save her from certain death. Bond, of course, picks up on what's going on almost immediately, and they start to develop a sort of relationship between the two, but it's one born out of course, intensive stress and life-threatening situations. Vivian is always observing Bond and making judgments, and strikingly, when she first sees him, her immediate thought is, oh, this man looks dangerous. Oh no, it's another one of these killers. And this is one of the themes of the book that Fleming did express he wanted to do, which was to try and underline how James Bond was a dangerous character and moved in a dangerous world, and was not necessarily a heroic character to emulate, because that was something he had sort of drawn out of seeing his books be popular with children. And so there was a sort of knee-jerk reaction against that, at least to some degree. And he said that was one of his aims with this book, to show that James Bond was not a purely heroic character. And the reader can understand where he was going with that concept, but in this story, Bond as a character is still St. George slaying the dragon to rescue the fair maiden. I mean, he shows up at the 11th hour and is the savior of Vivian Michel, so it's kind of hard to not see him as a heroic character, particularly because you're reading from Viv's perspective, and she can't help but obviously feel some level of adoration towards the figure that has just saved her life, or is there and is her obvious salvation in this time of crisis. So I think that theme only goes so far, and it comes back again at the end, and probably a little bit too heavy-handed of a manner. The rest of the act, and thus the rest of the book, because there are only 3 acts and it is a shorter book, is Bond attempting to deal with horror and Slugsy, and there are several set pieces, and eventually the motel is set ablaze. There is a fiery climax, quite a bit of action mixed in throughout between the 4 characters, and then a final sort of surprise moment, Bond and Vivian getting together, and then Bond leaving, and Vivian left to sort of pull herself together once more and reflect on her experience. none of this is surprising. Everything that happens is pretty much what you would expect, and it's all in the one act of the book. So it's not like there's a whole lot of development either. So it's quite simple and straightforward. And this is where I think most people start to think that this is not as good of a book, because it doesn't have the expected sort of more grandiose or larger than life Fleming plot qualities. It doesn't have the Fleming sweep of his narrative drive, but you also have to keep in mind it's not supposed to. It's a book written from a different perspective about a different character who is not experienced in the world of action and espionage and death. And so it being more of a character study means that the plot can be more simple. The trouble is it doesn't do anything you don't expect it to, and it's having to do everything in a shorter page count. And so if you look at the book structurally, I think it actually starts to resemble more of Fleming's short stories from For Your Eyes Only. It's almost as if it's an expanded short story. You could imagine a girl being menaced at motor court and James Bond suddenly showing up and having shootouts and battling the two goons and eventually doing away with them. You could actually picture that as a short story in For Your Eyes Only, and it would actually make sense. And the setting of upstate New York is at least a little bit similar to the setting of For Your Eyes Only in upstate Vermont and around the Canadian border. The fact that it's two villains who are essentially hoods speaking in gangster talk, and the story being very simple and something that you could be reading a 50s Private Eye or a pulp novel about. That's where I think people come up with the notion that it reads like a Mickey Spillane story, or that maybe Fleming was trying to write an American-style pulp thriller. I don't necessarily have a problem with that. I have an issue with the actual plotting of the third act just being so direct. It's kind of on the nose. Again, all the beats that happen, you can expect. It works for the story that Fleming is telling, and it works for being told from Vivian's experience of it. And she still participates in the story. She doesn't just cower in the corner. You know, she does pick up a gun at different points. She does try to help James Bond, and Bond at times does the obviously dated bit of inherent sexism of, you know, this is no place for you. You need to stay back here. But I think that's more simply due to him picking up on how she's frightened out of her wits, and she's out of her element entirely, and he doesn't want her to get killed. But she does try, and at least in some areas, hold her own. So she's not just, again, cowering in the corner. She does actually participate, which is nice. But my main issue with the third act is that it really only continues because James Bond makes several mistakes, and they're dumb ones. And this is something that pops up sometimes in Fleming, and it's the thing that always bugs me, because this happens once in From Russia with Love. It happens at the end of Diamonds Are Forever, where Bond ignores recognizing who is actually, Winton Kidd on the ocean liner, and is almost killed because of it. He's almost killed in From Russia with Love because he ignores the warning signs. But here in The Spy Who Loved Me, he does several things and makes several mistakes that it's, obviously, yes, he may be tired, but there's several of them in a row, and that's why he and Vivian are nearly killed. So some of them do have at least a little bit of the feeling of he made a mistake because the plot necessitated it, if that makes sense. I'm never a fan of heroic characters making mistakes because the plot says so. When it's happened before in the past novels, you can at least understand it, even though you may be reading those passages and literally screaming at the pages going, "What are you doing?" But here in Spy, because it's all happening in the final act of the book, and the events are compressed, because they're obviously taking place at the same time, you've got like two or three mistakes all after one another, and it just kind of it's too much at one point. If it was maybe one, that would be at least easier to swallow, essentially. But over the course of Bond and Viv's interactions and the events in Acts 2 and 3, we get more about their character, and we get a glimpse into the world of James Bond's life between assignments and where he is at this time. He's still trying to run down Spectre, and the whole reason he's there he describes as this case that involved dealing with a Spectre operative and a sting that went wrong, and men died on both sides, and Bond is now recovering from that. He's driving down to Washington to give a report, essentially, and he decided he wanted to take a drive to clear his head. So this is taking the James Bond of the Thunderball novel, who was already feeling malaise, and is putting him one step closer to where he is in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, where he's really full of malaise, and he's really tired of his job, and he's still trying to run down Blofeld inspectors. So this is a wonderful in-between point, and we get little flashes of Bond's traditional character and moments. He gets the drop on Horror and Slugsy and has the opportunity to kill them both in cold blood. He doesn't shoot them, they get away, and things continue. And Vivian actually confronts him on this. Why didn't you just shoot them? And he admits to her, he basically admits, maybe it was a mistake, but he's never been able to kill in cold blood like that. So all the moments of character fit in with all the established elements of Bond's character, and getting it from Vivian's perspective, we're essentially getting a window from another person's viewpoint into this particular evening in James Bond's life and what he finds himself doing. And he's kind of run down and tired, so I guess that's why he makes several mistakes in this. But we do get the fiery climax, and Bond and Vivian do obviously wind up sleeping together. But they've had at least some sort of courtship in a way over the course of the story. Again, it's one born out of tension, danger, excitement, and the threat of death, which is a key element of any Bond and female companion experience and the relationship of the book. So it's obviously very rushed because they're just knowing each other for this one evening and a few hours. And of course, Vivian has the experience with Bond, and it's unlike her past two experiences. So essentially, she has finally been with a man who actually, for lack of a better term, made love to her and made her feel something. And so that, as the sort of culmination of this whole cycle of events, is what has allowed her to come away not being completely damaged, and hopefully this will help her deal with the turmoil she's experienced. She wakes up the next morning to find that Bond has already gone, but left her a handwritten note and has sent for all the local authorities to help clean up things, and that there might be some reward money in it for her, so she won't have to worry about finances, at least for a time. And even the note, as simple as it is, it has some humanity to it. There's some little touches there, and even a little bit of humor referring back to their discussion about the hotel soap that they have to use when, of course, they take a shower together. The book then closes with Vivian speaking to the local police and the state police, and then the chief sits her down and basically gives her this talk about not letting what she's just experienced and lived through stick with her, and that she needs to get on with her life. And if she had any sort of relations or hopeful ideas about this British Secret Service agent that had helped her get out of this, that she should dash those from her mind and forget about them, because this world of spies and killing and death was not for normal people and not for her, that it would only cause her further pain and turmoil or even get her killed, and so she should forget about this James Bond. This sequence actually goes on for quite a while, and this is where Fleming really hits that theme that he spoke of trying to make people realize that James Bond was not a an ostensibly heroic character, that he had darkness in him, and that was necessary to do the job that he had and carry a license to kill. It's a bit on the nose, perhaps, but you do have to keep in mind that this is an older law enforcement official talking to a younger woman, and he even says that she reminds him of a daughter, and so he feels this need to give her some sort of worldly wisdom in his mind. So, it is a little bit much, I suppose, but it fits with where Vivian is, and it allows her to process what she's experienced a little bit more. And then the book closes with essentially Vivian nodding along and deciding to not accept any of what has just been told to her. And she hops on her Vespa, kickstarts it, roars off, knowing that in spite of everything she's experienced, she's now come through it and is still alive and is stronger than she was before, and will always remember the spy who loved her, that the actions and words of James Bond will be written on her heart forever. So it has a nice poetic quality at the end in how it closes. And that's the entirety of the book. Again, it's not a very complicated plot. It's very straightforward. In fact, it's arguably too straightforward for a Fleming James Bond novel. But it's so experimental that I don't even know if calling it a James Bond novel is exactly fair or accurate. Structurally, it's more along the lines of, if you took 3 of the short stories and connected them, it's more of a page count like that. It is significantly shorter than the other novels, but also it's really, I think, best described as if you had the central concept as one of the James Bond short stories, but it was told from the woman's perspective. But you had it built up to with the woman recounting her life story and how she got to there in a whole first act, and then the second act is the menace arriving with horror and Slugsy, and then act 3 would have been just the short story section if this was part of the For Your Eyes Only collection. That's how I would describe this book. So it's obviously a full novel, but it's not as short as a novella, but it's also not the full James Bond experience you expect coming into it as a Bond fan, and especially after reading the past novels. But I do think it allowed Fleming to recharge his creative batteries. I do think it allowed him to get some things out of his system, obviously, that he was going through. It was coming after the whole Thunderball experience as well, and the Eon films were about to start, and those would influence the last couple of books as well. So this is another sort of turning point for the books, and I think it should be applauded that Fleming tried something so different. I don't think all of it works perfectly. I do think it does have some issues, but in some ways, I think it's a better book than Thunderball was, because in spite of everything, this whole book is Fleming's voice, and he's trying different things, and he's returning to certain elements from past books, and you've got his incredible descriptions of place and time, his descriptions of upstate New York and the motel. Everything is vividly researched. The amount of detail. He had been in the area because his friend Ivar Bryce had a hideaway retreat estate in the area, so he knew the lay of the land and could also dig around further. And Fleming writing about 50s and 60s hotels and motels is always fascinating. So that's another thing that, it also makes you think of the Saratoga Springs section in Diamonds Are Forever, especially because there's Bond in a hotel, complete with toilet seats, sanitized for your protection and all that fun stuff. But you always come back to the fact that the plot is so simple, and all the action is sort of squeezed in together towards the end of the book. So you don't get the action-adventure experience of a traditional Bond novel until, towards the very end. And then there's several things and a couple plot twists, and things happen rather quickly, and then the book's over, and you're like, oh, wait, that's it? So there is... I don't know if it's possible to feel fully satisfied as a James Bond fan looking for a James Bond experience. I think this is a book that opens itself up to you over really over the years as you reread it. It's a striking book on the first read, but it's all the little moments and the characterization and the introspection and the little bits you actually get about James Bond's character and where his headspace is at this time, and how he describes the mission that he had just been on that didn't go to plan and people died, and the aftermath of that, and why he decided to just get in a car and drive to Washington because he just had to do that. He had to clear his head. It adds up to a lot more than just being the failed experiment it's always called. I think that's an extremely unfair label. As an experiment, I think it's completely successful. It is a good book in its own right. And it's absolutely amazing how well Fleming writes from the female character's perspective for the most part. I think Vivian is one of Fleming's best female heroines, and she does not only endear herself to the reader, but she impresses the reader in how she keeps her head and tries to fight back and tries to help Bond, and doesn't let herself just be completely overwhelmed. And she really isn't a damsel in distress. Yes, she's in distress, but she's not particularly a damsel. She does find some hidden reserves of strength, and the reader realizes that this whole experience, capped off by her night with Bond, that's going to allow her to actually continue her life and maybe have found herself again, and thus be able to get over her past traumas. So it's some sort of catharsis in a way. So I wouldn't say that Spy is one of the best novels in the series, but I do think it is the most underrated, because I think it is often derided and overlooked unfairly. And I know there's people who have only read it once and never tried it again because it was so different. And I think that is doing a disservice to Fleming's abilities as a writer and his abilities to write things other than James Bond, and especially his abilities to write female characters, which I think is actually one of his best strengths as a writer, and something that the films never quite did as well. Now, there is one caveat, and the one thing about this book that kills me is a particular, well, it's a passage, but most of all, it's one particular line that Vivian has in her internal monologue. And this is the line that every time I reread the book, I know it's coming, and then I hit it, and I'm like, oh, geez. Now, for all I've said about how well Fleming writes Vivian as a character, he's still obviously writing about women from the perspective of being a British male of a certain age writing this book in 1962. So, it's never going to be fully authentic, obviously, but there are, one or two bits here and there where some dated elements creep in. And in particular, there's one line that I think is probably the most objectionable in all of the James Bond canon in terms of Fleming's works. I don't think it's meant to be taken literally, but the wording and the directness of it certainly causes the reader to cringe today and even in the past. It's, of course, an incredibly dated view of women's feelings towards sex itself, and it's in Vivian's reflections on spending the night with Bond and the act of sex itself, and how it relates to her past two traumatic experiences. Now, as I alluded to before, anyone who's read this book will very likely know which line I'm talking about. This is the point in the book where I always get to this section, and it's like, Ian, you were doing so well. You were doing so well in writing a female character, and it's this one line. It's so not good. I just have to be honest about it. But if you isolate the one line, it's far worse than it actually is, because Vivian goes on, and in the rest of this passage, she furthers her thought and actually talks about her feelings towards Bond and how she is still grounded in reality and knows that this is really just a one-time thing, and she can allow herself to become attached to this man or a man like him, but that it has been an experience for her that she will never forget, and why it means so much to her. So the passage, I think, is fine. It's in particular the opening line of the passage. That's the problem. It may be that if Fleming had chosen different words, he might have been able to make it work and it not be so completely cringe-inducing. But to just go ahead, I would like to read this passage, but it, of course, starts with the line in question I'm referring to. So here we go. All women love semi-rape. You see what I mean? But again, if you take that out of context and you just have the one line, it sounds terrible. However, I think it's important for the context of this line to be addressed, so I would like to just quote from the rest of the passage. So it continues with her reflections. They love to be taken. It was his sweet brutality against my bruised body that had made his act of love so piercingly wonderful. That and the coinciding of nerves completely relaxed after the removal of tension and danger, the warmth of gratitude, and a woman's natural feeling for her hero. I had no regrets and no shame. There might be many consequences for me, not the least that I might now be dissatisfied with other men. But whatever my troubles were, he would never hear of them. I would not pursue him and try to repeat what there had been between us. I would stay away from him and leave him to go his own road, where there would be other women, countless other women, who would probably give him as much physical pleasure as he had had with me. I wouldn't care, or at least I told myself that I wouldn't care, because none of them would ever own him, own any larger piece of him than I now did, and for all my life I would be grateful to him for everything. And I would remember him forever as my image of a man. How silly could one be? What was there to dramatize about this naked male person lying beside me? He was trained to fire guns, to kill people. What was so wonderful about that? Brave, strong, ruthless with women? These were the qualities that went with his calling, what he was paid to be. He was only some kind of spy, a spy who had loved me. Not even loved, slept with. Why should I make him my hero, swear never to forget him? I suddenly had an impulse to wake him up and ask him, "Can you be nice? Can you be kind?" I turned over on my side. He was asleep, breathing quietly, his head resting on his outflung left forearm, his right arm tucked under the pillow. Again the moon outside was bright. Red light filtered through the curtains, mixing the black shadows of his body with shining crimson highlights. I bent closely over him, breathing in his maleness, longing to touch him, to run my hand down his sunburned back, to where the brown had become abruptly white, where his summer bathing trunks had been. After looking long at him, I lay back. No, he was as I had thought him to be. Yes, this was a man to love. I think the passage continuing with Vivian sort of chiding herself in ways and thinking about who Bond really was and his profession, and that he was a killer and that he wasn't really a man to become involved with or to carry as a personal hero or figure of supreme greatness and all that stuff. I think that's really important, but she still will always carry the notion of Bond with her regardless, simply due to the experience and how he was toward her. So it's really the opening line of that passage, and really the second line too, probably. That's the cringe factor aspect of that particular moment. And that's the one place specifically in the book where Fleming writing from the female perspective does not really work. That's the one giant flashing neon sign that doesn't say vacancy. It says bad idea. You know? I would think it's just a matter of he should have written those lines differently, but that's the one part of the entire book that one line in particular, that's what always makes me wince terribly. So that's the one major oh dear moment of the book. And for me, that's the most cringe-inducing line in all of Fleming. I think most of the dated aspects that are scattered across the books can be understood with historical context, but that's the one most of all that I think really jumps out at me every time when I reread the books. It is what it is, but I think you should look at the rest of that passage along with that line. I don't think you should isolate that line and say, oh, the book is saying this is terrible. Well, yes, that notion is obviously terrible, but the rest of the passage does go further. There's more detail, and so you do need the context of that passage, but the line is really unfortunate. That's the best way to put it. So yeah, that's the one moment where in the entire book, I think Fleming does a remarkable job writing a female character and making the whole story be set from her perspective until you get to that one line, and then it's like, oh, geez. I think what makes the book work is that Vivian has an independence to her. She is her own person, and in spite of being pushed around and knocked about by the world, she has held on to that sense of self and manages to survive all of the various ordeals and come out the other side, and just roars off on her Vespa to continue her life how she sees fit. That's what I think gives the book its spirit, and that she comes through all of these events and has survived and taken her experience with Bond as the one positive that she carries with her for the rest of her life. So I do think the book works. I do think it is a good book. It is a departure, obviously, and it's not going to be for everyone. So I think every Bond fan has to make up their own mind on how effective the book is. But I do think everybody can agree that the plot is a bit too simplistic, and all of the action and episodes with James Bond himself is saved for the very end. And so that does make it pale in comparison to the other traditional Bond novels, having much more developed and much more Fleming feeling, incredibly inspired larger-than-life plots, or plots with larger-than-life elements, and having the larger-than-life supervillains. So you don't have any of that in this, and it's from a different perspective, and Bond is more of a supporting character. So it's a completely different world that James Bond just enters for a time in terms of the world of the story. At some points, what Fleming is trying to do, his themes of the book, at some points it's a little on the nose, especially the ending chat with Viv, and underlining there and at several other points that Bond isn't really a hero character. And if you want to, again, make a connection to Psycho, it could be said that the official talking to Vivian and talking for quite a while is a little bit similar to the psychologist at the end of Psycho talking for quite a while and saying stuff that the audience already has understood and put together themselves. So if you want to make another Psycho connection, you could actually the ending of The Spy Who Loved Me with the official going on and on and on is kind of like the psychologist at the end of the film. But Vivian is a striking character. She is her own person. She is endearing to the reader. She is one of Fleming's most completely realized female characters, because we get to spend the most time with her, as the book is from her perspective. And we get to know her entire life story, which is far more than we find out about the previous characters before this point. So we've gotten some of their histories, but here with Vivian, we get her whole history, and so we immediately care for her in the first act and want to see her survive through the events. The trouble is, we can tell where this story is going quite quickly, and there's not really any surprise for the Bond fan reading this book. So again, that's where the Mickey Spillane and American pulp thriller comparisons come in, and they're right in that the actual plot that emerges is right out of a standard pulp thriller. It's nothing earth-shattering. Overall, I do think the book is far too harshly criticized. I don't think, I think more people need to give it a chance and understand going in that it's a book that is purposely doing something different, and it's continuing some of the experimentation that Fleming had already done with the short stories, in particular Quantum of Solace. So I do think there are some issues, but I think it's a far better book than it ever gets credit for. It's still one of the less successful Bond novels, but I think that's in part due to it being so experimental and trying to really not be a traditional James Bond novel. And Fleming should be applauded for that, and I think the book should be examined for its strengths and not be derided for trying to do something different. It may not succeed in everything it tries to do, but it is still a really engaging reading experience as a book in its own right. Now, to talk about adaptations of the novel, we first have to look at the Daily Express newspaper strip. This was again adapted by Jim Lawrence and has art by Yaroslav Horak. This is another of the complete reinventions of the opening or other aspects of the story that then connect to Fleming's original material. Lawrence did this before with artist Horak on their adaptation of the Hildebrand Rarity, which is strikingly different and unique, and then basically builds the new plot into the actual original short story. And that's how they adapted it to comic form after the films had already become successful and were so strikingly larger in scope and scale than the original novels. So when it came time to adapt The Spy Who Loved Me from the original Fleming novel in the newspaper strip, they were doing this in 1967 into 1968. So by that point, the 5 first Connery James Bond films in the Eon series had already come out. So doing a newspaper strip version of the story as it is in the novel, that really wasn't going to fly, nor would the first act really translate to action-adventure newspaper strip daily serialization. So they had to reinvent the story and open it up. So really what they did is, I think, an alternate universe version of the story. This adaptation is what I think Eon probably would have done if they had been able to directly adapt the novel, and if they had to keep the novel story of woman being menaced at Motor Court Motel. So we again have the art by Horak, which is very striking, all of the faces in particular full of these incredible angular lines. But as you're looking here at the first pages of each of the daily strips, you'll notice that there's no sign of Vivian Michelle, no sign of the Dreamy Pines Motor Court, none of the stuff from the book. Because what Jim Lawrence's adaptation does is expand on the backstory of why Bond gets to the Dreamy Pines Motor Court. He invents this whole new plot to start the story off with forces trying to get top secret plans of a new fighter plane, essentially. And it is revealed to be the actions of Spectre, and Bond becomes involved when MI6 gets wind of this, and all this is taking place in Canada, which puts it close to the border location in upstate New York. And so there's also a little tinge of Thunderball and how Spectre was trying to obviously impersonate NATO officials and then steal the atomic bombs from the bomber. So it fits with established Bond lore. But there's all sorts of new business. There's the flyer who's being blackmailed by what is revealed to be Spectre, and the mysterious leader is a woman in disguise as an old crone in a secret base. Bond goes undercover pretending to be the pilot they're trying to blackmail to uncover this plot. And that's what leads to the shootout in the hotel and the operative getting killed that is described in the novel. So everything is a new build-up and a new plot to get Bond to that point. And then we essentially have Bond driving to Washington, and it transitions over into The Spy Who Loved Me story. But everything is worked in by expanding upon the backstory we only had Bond describe. Here we get to actually see it. So you see some of that depicted here, and of course the stakes are raised. There's a beautiful woman involved who may be more than what she seems, so it's a lot more developed. So this is where we suddenly transition to Viv at the Dreamy Pines, the fancies, and then taking over the motel. Horror and Slugsy show up and are perfect depictions of how they're described in the book, although I don't think Horror's metal teeth really come across. And then, of course, Bond shows up at the exact right time, And we have some really lovely visualizations of the scenes from the book, with Bond and Vivian outside, the motel being set on fire, their fight against Horror and Slugsy, Bond not shooting them in cold blood, and then, of course, the finale with the car going into the lake and beyond. So this is another of the really striking Daily Express strips. Not only do you get visualization of the actual book that was never turned into a film, and the artwork is really striking, but the whole opening is fantastic for a Bond fan because it's new material you've never experienced before, because Jim Lawrence did a brand new adaptation of the book. So you obviously lose out on all of Vivian's history and her backstory, and she's no longer the main character, and the story isn't told from her perspective. So this is a retelling of the Spy Who Loved Me novel from a traditional, outside perspective, as if it was a James Bond adventure through and through. So it's really two parts. The first part is expanding on the mission Bond is on, and then the second part is The Spy Who Loved Me. But the first part is wonderfully woven into the second part, so it flows. And this allows the story to be expanded, to be made bigger, and seem much more in line with what people expected from a James Bond adventure in 1967, when the films had already taken over the world. So this is another of the really wonderful surprises in reading the strip adaptations of Fleming novels, because most of them were very faithful adaptations, and so there's not much surprise for the reader who knows the books in and out. The fun factor is reading them in a different form and seeing how well the artwork conveys the spirit of Fleming, which it always does beautifully. But it's when you get into these later adaptations that they take a lot more risks with the adaptations, and that's what makes them more interesting than the well-done versions of the books that are just retelling the book plots beat for beat, but in abbreviated form. Then, of course, we turn to the Eon film using the novel's title, The Spy Who Loved Me, released as the 10th film and the third film of Roger Moore's tenure in 1977. Now, as I said, Fleming stipulated in his contract that Eon could only use the title of the book, but not actually adapt the book itself. I guess that didn't apply to the Daily Express newspaper strip, as they had no issue in adapting the novel plotline. But the film was very difficult to get going. It went through a very torturous story development process. This actually lasted for quite some time, and is partially why there was a 3-year gap between films. And there was also the breakup of the Saltzman and Broccoli partnership, with Saltzman selling out to United Artists and Cubby Broccoli solely producing Spy as his first film as a solo producer of the Bond series. So it was a definite moment where the series had to reestablish itself and prove its ability to continue on and be successful once more. But it was also a difficult film to pull off because they could not use the Fleming source material. They could only use the title and maybe some elements scattered in from the book, but also some other pieces of Fleming that they hadn't exactly used before. And so, ironically, after a variety of writers and completely different story approaches that run the gamut from bringing back Tatiana Romanova to having some more science fiction and outlandish elements to having all sorts of names attached, what they hit upon, what we got in the final film, was a first version by legendary series writer Richard Maybaum, who was really the brain behind the entire original series, writing or co-writing 13 of the first 16 films. But then that was handed over to Christopher Wood, who was known for his almost satirical novels at that time, and had also worked with director Lewis Gilbert, who directed the film. And so Spy has a different tone to it, but the approach does at least reflect the novel in that there is a heroine of the story, a female character who eventually has a relationship with Bond, and that is, of course, Major XXX, Anya Amasova. So they made the decision to change it to being a fellow competitive agent and made it a Russian agent, which I think was the perfect direction to go in, because that gives you so much to play off of in a story and allowed Roger Moore's talents to come to the surface and shine brightly throughout, because it allows some wonderful joking, bickering, and one-upsmanship between the two throughout the course of the film. And at least a romance starts to blossom, and eventually it culminates in the ending of the film, and you can actually feel it and see it develop over the course of the film. It's a beautifully realized film that is obviously not doing the book, but there are at least some elements of the book still in there. There is a female main character who is loved by James Bond, except she's now a Russian secret agent and Bond's equal in a lot of aspects. So it is a different sort of dynamic, but still similar in some sorts of ways, and it justifies keeping the title. But you've also got the villain of Jaws having the metal teeth, which is really drawn from horror in the book, having the steel-capped teeth. Then you've also got the other secondary henchman of Sandor, played by Milton Reed, and so when you've got Milton Reed standing next to Richard Kiel as Jaws, you do have some of the dynamic of horror in Slugsy, with the taller villain with the metal teeth and the shorter villain with the bald, very rounded head. So maybe that was intentional. I'm not for sure. It may just be because of who they cast, but there's at least a little tinge of that in there. But really, that's about it in terms of what the spy film takes from the original novel. However, it does actually borrow from another piece of James Bond media, because after everything they did to make a new film and not use the book's plot, and all the different writers and drafts and ideas they had, and then not using Maybaum's first version that was a bit more gritty and in certain ways a more politically minded film of that time, they basically didn't go that route, and then Christopher Wood wrote the primary script, and then Tom Mankiewicz did a final uncredited rewrite at the end, I think primarily what would now be called a dialogue polish, and tweaking some things and adding some more of the humor and one-liners. But when you look at The Spy Who Loved Me as a finished film, structurally it might seem a little bit familiar to Bond fans, because I don't think they were intending to do this, but it basically is, for lack of a better term, it's kind of remaking the You Only Live Twice film, except now instead of Spectre stealing spacecraft to instigate World War III, you have Karl Stromberg stealing submarines to instigate World War III, and it's the same plot scenario, but the actual films are entirely different, so it really doesn't matter. But it's kind of funny when you think about it, that Spy as a film is technically a remake of You Only Live Twice's plot, except it's underwater and it doesn't have Spectre. But originally it did have Spectre, but Kevin McClory popped up again and was trying to make his Warhead project in 1975 and got wind of that, so they just removed all traces of Spectre and changed it to Karl Stromberg. And to then further this line of thought even more, if you then think about Moonraker in 1979, Moonraker is very much remaking The Spy Who Loved Me, because they just wanted to repeat the success. So in a lot of ways, Drax's plot in Moonraker is kind of like if you took The Spy Who Loved Me but you put it in space. So Moonraker is kind of a remake of The Spy Who Loved Me plot, which was already a kind of remake of You Only Live Twice's plot, except now we're back in outer space again. And this time Bond actually does go into space, where he didn't in You Only Live Twice. So there you go. There's your crazy James Bond fan theory, if you want to go down that route. There is one other aspect of the 1977 film that needs to be discussed, and that is the tie-in novelization done by the primary screenwriter Christopher Wood. Now, this was sold as a novelization of the film, and it is a novelization of the film's plotline, and it has the poster artwork of the film on the original paperback. But it is not a novelization of the film exactly as it is. Wood's novelization is actually a novelization of the film's storyline as if it was written by Ian Fleming. It is a full-on Fleming pastiche featuring the literary James Bond. It is an absolutely majestic piece of writing. It is the best Ian Fleming pastiche anyone has ever done. And if you ever wondered what the Spy Who Loved Me film plotline would be like if it was grittier and had the literary Bond running around in it, and even had a torture sequence in it, this book is for you. It is one of the absolute best James Bond books not written by Ian Fleming. It is the greatest shock and surprise of all of the continuation novels, because the screenwriter of The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker ironically wrote novelizations of those two films as if they were Fleming's Bond being written by Ian Fleming, placed into the narratives and plots of the film versions. It's really unique as an experience, and each one is great. I think the Spy Who Loved Me one is a little bit better because there's more things that are unique to its novelization as compared to the Moonraker one, but they really form an incredible pair. They're one and the same in terms of their approach. I wish these were better known in the fan community. They are absolutely masterfully done. And if you don't like certain aspects of the Roger Moore tenure, or if you prefer the literary Bond and Ian Fleming, or if you prefer the earlier 1960s Eon films that were much closer to Fleming overall, these will really blow your minds. They are incredible. So The Spy Who Loved Me novelization is perhaps the supreme realization of the Spy Who Loved Me project, because it's bringing everything back to the world of Fleming and the literary Bond. And it's also kind of funny if you want to read it and imagine the Roger Moore Bond performance in the spy film in the novelization. And again, as I said, Wood invents a Fleming-inspired torture sequence. And, I mean, it is Fleming-inspired because it's basically Bond's genitals strapped to a car battery and then trying to picture Roger Moore's Bond. Even though there are plenty of serious moments scattered throughout the spy film that are often overlooked, and it's a masterful performance that Roger gives, it's very striking to think about that torture sequence and picturing Roger in there. It almost makes you think every time the battery is turned on and Bond is electrocuted that we might have gotten some of the classic Roger Bond oohs, you know. It's the things that make Bond fans chuckle, of course. But the novelization of the Spy Who Loved Me film is essential. Again, it's the best Fleming pastiche anybody's ever done, and it is the hidden gem of the entirety of the world of James Bond continuation fiction. It is an incredible experience because it's really the unison of Fleming's style in the literary Bond and what Eon did with The Spy Who Loved Me as a film by completely ignoring like 99.9% of the original source material that they were told to not bother with. And then I'd like to talk about possible influences of the original novel on other James Bond films. Now, there's a couple little moments in the book that may have influenced moments in other Eon films. And this is, of course, my own fan theory. It's not anything we know for sure, but every once in a while you see a little piece that was not used in a film adaptation in one of Fleming's novels, and Eon had this habit of always trying to keep an eye on things that they didn't use. And so sometimes they would take a little nugget or a subplot or one of the short stories and weave it into another script that obviously wouldn't have the title of the source material because they were adapting or doing something else. So in The Spy Who Loved Me, there's a couple little moments that I notice on this rereading. One is when Bond is recounting how he got one over on the villains by having them break into his hotel room and shoot up the bed, but of course Bond wasn't really there. And that is by Bond describing how he put pillows and some straw in the bed to look like hair and had the lights off, but enough light coming in through the window, and then was hiding and saw the hand come in holding a silenced pistol and shooting up the bed. And that, of course, I think would immediately make Bond fans think of the scene in Dr. No, which was invented for the film, of Professor Dent coming into Miss Taro's cottage, and we have the hand coming in with the silenced pistol firing at the pillows in the bed, and Bond gets the drop on him, and we have the famous confrontation where Bond kills Professor Dent hand in cold blood. Now, that scene was not in the novel. It was entirely invented for the film, and it's one of the best scenes in the film. In fact, the entire sequence in Miss Taro's cottage, I think, is the supreme moment the film adds that was not in the book. It's so good, I wish it was in the book. That whole sequence is one of the key moments in the world of James Bond and tell you exactly everything you need to know about the character. And the film, of course, came out in 1962 after the novel, so it's possible that Richard Maybaum and Wolf Mankiewicz, when they were writing the script, may have seen an advanced copy of Spy and had read it and were looking for something to do in that sequence and may have thought of this, or maybe they had read the book and just weren't thinking, and that's where they drew the concept from. But I think it's certainly possible that the Dr. No film may have been influenced by the Spy Who Loved Me novel just in that one particular story conceit. But it's a classical idea anyway of Pulp Fiction, of the hero faking out the villains or the henchmen by doctoring up something in a bed and having them attack it to get the drop on them, or make them think that they've killed him. But it's still, the visuals are so similar with, the hand with the silenced pistol coming in and firing at the bed with pillows in it, that I think it probably was an influence. Another moment that's small, but it is rather similar to an Eon film, is when Bond and Vivian are out in the woods outside the motel, and there's one point where Bond tells Vivian to go run off into the woods at a certain point because the Horror and Slugsy are going to be coming out, and they're outside lying in wait, and Bond just has his pistol, and he's also given Vivian a gun as well. And just the whole setup of that little moment, it makes me think of the moment in the Goldfinger film where after the first part of the DB5 chase, and they've stopped and they're shooting with Goldfinger's Korean guards, and you have a bit of a gun battle, Bond turns to Tilly Masterson and says, "Run for that bracken when I tell you." It's obviously different, but it's at night in the woods, and there's danger, and there's villains to be fought off, and Bond's got his pistol in hand, and he tells a beautiful woman to run into the woods. So, it feels a bit similar. Then there's another moment when Horror and Slugsy get in the car and are charging at Bond and Vivian. Vivian's off to the side. She fires a couple shots, but primarily Bond is standing directly in the car's path. The car is coming right at him with the headlights on, and Bond gets into gunman's crouch and fires, and the bullet takes out one of them and causes the car to crash. So that obviously seems like it influenced the scene in For Your Eyes Only when Bond comes out and famously fires at Locke, gets into the gunman's crouch as Locke is driving to smash into Bond. Bond fires, hits Locke in the shoulder, Locke crashes, and that sets up the famous cliff scene where Bond kicks the car off. So it's basically taking a little moment and then echoing and translating it. So I think that was obviously probably an influence as well. And then lastly, you have the car with Horror and Slugsy going into the lake and sinking, and Bond and Vivian watch it sink into the lake and then walk off. And then, of course, Slugsy isn't dead and survives and comes back to attack them later. And this seems like it was an influence on A View to a Kill, except in the film, it's the Rolls Royce with Bond and Tibbet being pushed into a lake with Zorin and Mayday looking on, and once the car sinks, they walk off and leave, and then it's Bond who survives. So basically, A View to a Kill, the film, takes this little piece from the spy novel and just inverts it. Now to move on to cover artworks and different editions of the novel over the years. The first is, of course, the UK first edition released by Jonathan Cape in 1962, featuring the iconic and absolutely stunning artwork by Richard Chopping, once again giving us a legendary cover for a Fleming James Bond novel. This is done in his established style, so we have the sort of wood grain background, we have the stenciled Fleming credit, like it's been stamped on, and then we have a hyper detailed rendering of a throwing knife or dagger stabbing the burned fragment of the page featuring the title written as if it's from Vivian herself. And so we see the burned page saying "The Spy Who Loved Me." And then we have the flower as well to suggest romance, but of course it's a single flower that's been plucked. So it just has a wonderful sense of drama and romance and danger and excitement, and is beautifully composed, hyper detailed, and is another of Chopping's just masterful pieces of artwork, and it's one of the great book covers. The UK first edition also had some fancy embossing on the actual boards of the hardcover. I think it's the actual dagger that was put on there. And it also had an interior illustration, basically an artist's rendering of the Dreamy Pines motor court. This image was only reproduced in certain versions of the book. So here it is in my Signet paperback. So this is a wonderful lovely visual of the Dreamy Pines and the wonderful, beautiful woods around it and Lake George. So it's just a nice, a very evocative visual that I wish was in every version, but again, it's only in certain printings. In the US, we got the first edition in 1962 as well, and thankfully, they were smart enough to realize a great piece of art when they saw it, so we got the Richard Chopping artwork as well. So it is one of the US covers that has matched the UK version, and will give you the beautiful Chopping artwork, and should hopefully be at least a little bit more affordable for collectors today, trying to get an original James Bond edition with Chopping artwork. In 1963, there was a British Book Club edition in hardcover. This has unique artwork like the other British Book Club editions that have been done of the other books. This features Vivian running in the woods at night, running for her life, and it's also in the pounding rain. So this is I think it's obviously a much more classical cover for a book of this type, something that you would expect a book in the late 50s or early 60s to have cover-wise for this particular story in this setting. And you've got the ominous rising mountains in the background, the title in a sort of off purple with Fleming's credit in the center. And you can see Vivian there running, and she's at an angle so you can tell she's running. So it's got some definite drama to it. It's a good-looking cover, but it's also not immediately attention grabbing as much as you would like for a James Bond cover. So I think it's very good. I think it's obviously very descriptive of the moment where Viv runs off into the woods trying to escape horror and Slugsy before Bond shows up. So it is an event from the actual book, so that's always a plus for a cover. But I just think it's not quite as immediately arresting to the eye when you first see it. Then we turn primarily to the paperbacks, and this is interesting because Fleming actually stipulated that he didn't want the book to see any more print runs. He was so stung by the criticism of the book that after the first editions and hardcovers, he just didn't want the book to be in circulation. So it was only later on, in particular in the UK after his death, that the book actually turned up in paperback form. So in the US, we got it first primarily in 1963 in the traditional Signet style that had emerged with the James Bond thriller on the side, wonderful evocative Barry Phillips artwork in small form in the center, Fleming's credit in large typeface, and the title on the bottom on a nice bold color background. Now this version would see a variety of different print runs, some with hype logos and things printed directly onto the cover, and then eventually they would add the 007 pages in the upper left corner of the cover, which is the logo added for the final reprints under this particular style. Now here on the cover, they've gone for a wonderful sort of mint or forest green to make you think of the Dreamy Pines and the setting. You've got wonderful, highly evocative artwork of actually seeing the trees, of seeing Bond bending over to light a cigarette and seeing the light up his face. So it's obviously like he's having a smoke before doing battle. And then you've got Vivian roaring away on her Vespa. And so I just love what they did with this cover. I love that the title's in a soft yellow. I think that it just works beautifully in terms of using the Signet design and using color and having just enough images in terms of the artwork. And I think it just perfectly suggests the type of book you're getting, in that there's something about the color being a little bit softer as well that seems to indicate, at least it always says to me, that this book is a bit different and it's got a different perspective. And I think this is one of the best covers Signet did. It's very subtle in what it's doing, but it does grab your attention when you're just seeing the cover, and I think it's so wonderfully evocative of the book that's inside. Now, The Spy Who Loved Me saw another publication in 1964, though probably not the form Fleming or any Bond fan would want, and that's an abridged version in a magazine. Now, some of Fleming's Bond stories did appear in magazine form in abridged versions, or some of the short stories. Those were typically in issues of Playboy sometimes, but they also appeared in other places. So here, The Spy Who Loved Me appeared in an abridged form in 1964 in an issue of Stag Magazine, and it was retitled Motel Nymph. So this is obviously playing up on the pulpier and pulp thriller aspects that some might criticize the book for being too similar to. And it does feature some really interesting and very pulpy illustrations and pieces of artwork. I don't know exactly how this happened, but this is essentially the full-on pulp fiction lurid version of the story in terms of how it's packaged. And of course, the artwork is primarily focusing on poor Vivian being more scantily clad, but it is certainly attention grabbing, and I love the title for being so wonderfully cheeky and obvious, but also with that wonderful ring of pulpiness to it. And technically it does fit Acts 2 and 3, because Vivian could be said to be a motel nymph, I suppose. So it does have a certain ring to it, although it is very sleazy. In the UK, Pan Books was finally able to do a paperback, and this came out in 1967-68. So obviously a good number of years after the book's publication and several years after Fleming's death in 1964. So this was done in their mid-60s James Bond design, where Bond was in bold black letters at the top, and they would go for a really attention-grabbing image as the background. Here on Spy, they've done something that is really, really subtle, but it is actually quite effective, I think. And so you've got what is obviously a roadmap that is starting to burn. So you see the flame coming up from the bottom in the center. And if you scrutinize, you'll actually see it's a map of upstate New York. So they took the time to actually get the appropriate map, and so you could actually imagine this is a map that's burning up in the flames of the motel on fire. So it's really effective, and having it actually burning gives you a sense of danger and excitement that you're going to get at the end of the book. So it really works. It's just really, really subtle at the same time. And while that's great, it's also it may be a little bit too subtle, if that makes sense. I think it's a very good cover, and I know what it's doing, but most people, and especially people who have never read the book, will probably not know what it's doing, nor will they scrutinize and realize that it's a map of upstate New York that's on fire. But I do give them tons of extra points for having a really cool idea and trusting the potential reader to see that and recognize that it's something connected to the book, and it's got some wit and intelligence to it. The same can't exactly be said for the Pan 1972 cover. This is the white cover series that all featured a variety of women in different poses on a white background, seemingly photos taken on some sort of stage. And here for Spy, there's a beautiful scantily clad woman on the floor being menaced by a bald-headed guy in a tank top with what looks like a machine gun. So Yeah, none of these covers expressly have anything to do with the books, but some you can occasionally draw some connections. So here, because she's on the floor and the man menacing her is bald, you could say that it might be slightly reminiscent of Viv and Slugsy, but also it's clearly not them because it's a bald-headed guy in a tank top with a machine gun. I mean, there is technically a machine gun that appears in the book, but it's not handled like this, and this is also clearly an image from the 1970s. So it is what it is. I guess it's an okay cover, but yeah, it's not really doing a scene from the book, and I just kind of find it hilarious that it's so clearly a 1970s image, but I do give them credit. It looks like they at least tried to slightly make it like a scene from the book. In 1972, we got the book released in what is now termed the Pan Still Life series. This was where each book cover was a beautifully composed photograph of various items that were supposed to be directly referencing things from the book. And they took an incredible amount of care to try and get matching elements and make something that was also visually arresting. So as a fan, you can pore over these covers and try to decipher what each image is and what it's referring to exactly. And so on this one, it's got this wonderful black cover background with the images, and obviously there's a gun stock, there's a burned photo of a woman, and she's got the goggles on, so it's obviously a burned photo of Vivian with her goggles for riding on her Vespa. And then there's also what looks like a crucifix necklace poking out, and then various... I can't tell if it's feathers or pieces of like a torn piece of furniture and like the stuffing coming out or something. But it's obviously bits and pieces from the story, and I think it's gathered to make it look like it's some stuff that survived the motel being burned. There's a couple other elements that I'm not sure about, but I can say that just above the photo, you see what looks like a red handle, and that, of course, I think is the ice pick that Vivian uses to defend herself at one point. So even that makes it onto the cover. So these are just incredibly well done and very much beloved by fans today because it was obviously a sign that somebody put in a lot of effort to make these completely unique and fully representative of each book. In 1978, from Triad Panther, we saw the book in the Girls on Guns series. This refers to these paperbacks all featuring matching black covers and featuring a beautiful woman draped across a gigantic golden 45 automatic. At least I think it's a 45. So here we have the title in a sort of pink to match the woman's pink hat, and you see she's on top of a golden pistol that's gigantic for some reason. This has nothing to do with the book, and the woman in question is obviously just a beautiful woman who decided to wear a pink hat that day. It is not depicting Vivian from the book, so it's just another one of these covers where they tried a matching series aesthetic, and while they're interesting looking, they don't really scream James Bond outside of perhaps trying to mimic the iconography of Morris Bender's title sequences for the films. In the US, we finally got another paperback version as part of the Berkley series of reprints. So in the early to mid 1980s, most of Fleming's books were reissued in their style done for the John Gardner paperbacks of his continuation novels. So on Spy, we have a yellow background with the Ian Fleming's Master Spy James Bond format. Bond is in red. The colors would differ on all of these. Then the title is in a sort of purple, and we have Bond in action pose standing with pistol off to the side. So it works, and these covers do look better in person, but the Fleming reprints in the Berkley series are actually rather uncommon. They didn't seem to print very much, and you don't stumble across them very often in the wild. They also didn't do all of his books, and some of them they did far less. So while I have a few of them and I've seen some before, I've never actually seen the Berkley edition of The Spy Who Loved Me in person. These covers do grow on you. They're a bit simplistic, but they do have the bold, attention-grabbing color, and if you get all of them, you can make a nice matching set with the John Gardner paperbacks. In the UK, Coronet Books tried a similar approach with their 1989 paperback version. This was also a matching series of other Fleming reprints, and also featured a silhouetted Bond with a gun in action pose, except Coronet's version always has the figure Bond looking like he's standing on top of his own name, and in some it looks like he's about to fall over. These are basically the more sedate version of the 80s Berkley covers, but I've never felt they're as effective as the US Berkley covers. Here, at least on this one, it's okay, but it's also a silhouetted Bond in tuxedo, and it's not suggestive of what The Spy Who Loved Me actually is as a book. So basically, I think this one is, really, it's a kind of imitation of the 80s US paperback cover, and I don't think it's as good. We finally got another edition in 1995 as part of the James Bond Classic Library series of hardcovers. They did most of Fleming's books in this series, but not all of them. However, these are some of the nicest hardbacks to collect these days because they all featured really striking, unique, matching artwork. They all have a particular style that's more cartoonish on the surface, but they have bold color, and each one depicts an action scene from one of the books, or at least something adjacent to one of the books. So here on Spy, it's clearly Bond and Vivian in the woods, with Bond in action pose, Vivian just behind him, looking on in fear, and we see the two flashes from the other side, which obviously means Horror and Slugsy firing at Bond, Bond about to fire back, standing in the trees. And there's also a depiction of it being at night because you get a nice sort of nighttime aesthetic of black and blue purple, and you get the shadows of Bond and Viv mixing in with the shadows of the trees. So I think this is another effective cover from this series. Yes, the artwork has a certain aesthetic that not everybody's going to like, but this is an actual scene from the book, and it's well done, and it's attention grabbing, and I think it's another nice cover in this series. In the UK, Cornet Books did a new paperback as part of their matching series in 1996. So this has a wonderfully striking image of elements of the book in the center, with a really striking dark background, and then Bond on top as a logo with the title and Fleming's credit on the bottom. So it matches all the other covers in this series. Here in the image, we've got elements reflected in an eyeball. So you've got that classic sort of striking image that makes you immediately think of things like the opening of Blade Runner. But here you've got the eye reflecting what's supposed to be the Dreamy Pines motor court. So you've got the motel, and you've got the rain and this feeling of it being a stormy night and things, and it being a sort of ominous figure looking on. So I think it's very effective. The only problem is, if you scrutinize closely, the image of the motel doesn't match up with how it is in the book. It looks more like a sort of stereotypical American motel, and there's a railroad crossing sign, and it also doesn't look quite like it's in upstate New York, but at least they tried, and they made a really striking image. It's just, if you scrutinize, you'll see that it doesn't quite match up with the actual location of the book. But that's really my only criticism of this, because otherwise it's another really striking cover in this Coronet series. In 2002, we got the new paperback version as part of the now iconic series of Penguin paperbacks with Richie Fahey artwork that matched. So this has the incredible matching design with 007 and Fleming's credit, a wonderful bold red background, but also with accents of pink to perhaps suggest that this story has a more emotional context to it, and of course is going to be a different experience inside. We've got Horror and Slugsy depicted exactly as they're described in the books. We've got flames to suggest the motel that's going to be set on fire. We've even got Slugsy stealing a television as they do in the book, and most of all, you've got Vivian, as she is described in the book, leaning against her Vespa in pure pulp fantasy pinup mode, essentially. So this just screams pulp fiction flavor. It is a striking cover that has aspects directly from the book, beautifully realized, and has all of the wonderful pulpy goodness that we love in the artwork of the 50s and 60s in terms of book covers. So this is just masterful. And just like all the covers in this series, the only problem is this is no longer in print. So these are starting to become collector's items, and you can understand why. And they also show an incredible amount of love and affection for the actual works, because they are trying to mimic the aesthetics of the past in terms of packaging and design, but also vividly replicating the characters and elements from the story within. Unfortunately, Penguin in the UK in the same year did not decide this was a good enough cover for the British market. So in the UK, they did this series of these matching covers that all featured some strange backgrounds of various shapes and colors and like cold metallic sheen in a way. So here on The Spy Who Loved Me, we have a sort of bluish metal background, or lights reflecting on metal at an angle that are bluish. It might be trying to suggest rain falling, perhaps. I don't know. Most of these covers, I really don't know what they were thinking. They're attention grabbing, I guess, because you see this and you don't know what it is, so you wind up looking at this cover a while longer, scratching your head, and that's not the kind of attention grabbing you want to get. It doesn't suggest the book at all. It's not the worst cover for the book, but that's the 2002 British Penguin series for you. They don't make any sense. However, Penguin redeemed themselves, because in their modern classics version of the book that was done in 2004, also with a later reprinted version, I think they did just about the best modern classics cover of a Bond novel that they ever did. And this, for Spy, is obviously what looks like Bond's hand on the edge of the motel bed. You've got a little plate with a cigarette, you've got an empty drink glass, and you've got a gun that's still smoking. And it's all illuminated by a single little table lamp. It is wonderfully evocative. It's evocative of the book. It's, of course, something that doesn't exactly happen in the book, but Bond is always sleeping with his gun under his pillow, and there's action. So I love how wonderfully evocative this image is and how understated it is. And I really think it's probably the best modern classics cover Penguin did, which is saying something, because they had one or two good ones and then the others were just film stills and they didn't even care if it was the right movie. And so that's how you got their modern classics of Thunderball that had an image from the office fight and You Only Live Twice on it as the cover. So their modern classics versions did not have a lot of thought put into the covers, but this one did. And then, of course, there was a second version that obscured the image by putting the credits over it, but at least it was still the same nice image. In 2009, we got the matching series of Michael Gillette covers. These all featured beautiful women with the title and Fleming's credit tattooed or stenciled on their back, as if in reference to Robert McGinnis's iconic Casino Royale artwork for the 1967 film. So here we've got a beautiful woman with a dress falling off her shoulder. We've got the title and Fleming's credit stylized across her back, and she's sort of tinted red on a white background. And I suppose this is supposed to be Vivian, so at least the female figure on the cover is possibly the main female character of the book. I do really like these as pieces of artwork, but as Bond covers, they're kind of hit or miss for me. They have become major collector's items, though, because Gillette's artwork is amazing, and so you can actually still get prints of these pieces of art from his website, but the books themselves have become collector's items. In 2012, Vintage Books in the UK did a new paperback as part of their matching series, so this has a sort of mint teal green as the background with the title, but the O's of the words are turned into either bullet holes or little burned circles. I'm thinking they're bullet holes that have burned through. So it's effective, it works, and it's another nice cover in this series. I think the only problem is the actual burned holes kind of obscure the other letters. So, I mean, you can tell what it's saying, but you do have to kind of scrutinize a little bit. We also got the vintage books There Is Only One Bond cover. So this is part of one of the most generic runs of the books, where they just mashed together various black and white images and would seemingly Photoshop a male figure in the front that's supposed to be James Bond. And then you had the 007 in the sky and the title in a sort of off gold. Here for Spy, somebody actually tried, though, as this one is at least somewhat evocative of the setting. You've got what looks like it could possibly be upstate New York as the background. You've got a vintage car on the side of the road, and you've got presumably James Bond standing in the middle of the road with a gun, looking like he's waiting for somebody to shoot at. So it at least has a little bit of the flavor of the setting of the book. It, of course, looks like it's broad daylight, so that doesn't work. I don't think this is necessarily the right location, nor does Bond ever stand in the middle of the road in broad daylight with gun in hand waiting for somebody. So, I mean, it doesn't work, but at least you can see what they were going for, and that they at least kind of tried to make it look like the setting of the book. But these covers in this particular series were really generic, and they were just basically Photoshop mashups. 2012 also saw the release of the Thomas and Mercer paperback version. This has the same uniform cover design aesthetic as the others, so everything is in black, white, and red, and you've got shapes on the front that form some sort of singular image, and then there's a red 007 circle logo somewhere. So here on Spy, it looks like they just did the flames of the motel on fire. That's it. And if you hadn't read the book, you wouldn't know what those were. And it's kind of like a Rorschach blot in that you can't always tell what it's supposed to be, if you can tell it's supposed to be anything at all. But here, at least, you can kind of tell, I think, that it's supposed to be flames, so you know that something's on fire. But, you know, it's kind of hard to tell that it's even flames when it's black and white and it's just black shapes that's supposed to be fire. So it is a bit limited, but at least it's one of the covers in this series where you can actually sort of tell what it's supposed to be, because, I mean, some of the covers in this series are just lines or interconnecting lines or random shapes. So they just, I guess, decided to depict the flames of the dreamy pines. In 2023, Ian Fleming Publications was able to get the rights to publish the novels themselves. So the estate was now handling the books, and unfortunately decided to hire sensitivity readers and selectively alter all of the books, but not actually explain or detail what the changes were that were made. So Live and Let Die reverted to the slightly altered US version, which Fleming had authorized, but everything else was new changes done by IFP to varying degrees, and each of the books carry a blanket statement that this has been done, but it isn't actually telling the reader what changes were made. And now these altered editions have become the standard worldwide, so every new edition of the book, every ebook, and even the audiobooks are all these altered, censored versions. All of these should be avoided at all costs and should be boycotted by all Bond fans. The estate obviously had the best of intentions, but this is a practice that should not be condoned or ever done again. It is wrong to alter someone's work decades after the fact, even with the best of intentions. So for the UK market, IFP commissioned a new series of paperbacks with matching uniform cover artwork. These all feature an oversized 007 across the whole front cover, and then the title and Fleming's credit on top and bottom in white. So here, the 007 logo is lit up like a neon sign, like the vacancy sign of the Dreamy Pines. You've got the pines actually coming in from the sides, and you've got the forest floor on the bottom, and it looks like it's the night sky behind the lit up sign that says 007. So I think this is one of the best covers in this series. It's evocative of the story. It has a sense of mystery, has a sense of drama. It's a little bit cheeky and fun by making 007 a motel neon sign. It may be not as effective if you don't know the book and haven't read it, but still, I think this is attention grabbing. I think it works. And for this style of having a giant 007, I think this is one of, if not possibly, the best cover they did in this series. The only trouble is you should never purchase or support or read this version because it's a censored text. So in the US, over the next year, HarperCollins started issuing these censored altered works as part of a new uniform paperback design. And the design and overall aesthetic of these books is without question the cheapest, least inspired, and worst the books have ever seen across their entire publishing history. So all of these have a black background with generic fonts, a generic James Bond on the top, Fleming's credit on the bottom, the title in some particular shade that's supposed to make it stand out from the black background, but frankly really doesn't, and then a generic 007 in the center, and inside the two interconnecting zeros, you've got some sort of image that's supposed to suggest the book. But the images they chose are stock photos from photo services. So here for Spy, they've got an image of what looks like a roadway from overhead, and you see some trees around it. So I guess it's supposed to be suggesting the road to the dreamy pines. So at least it's seemingly detailing something from the book, but it just looks terrible. And on top of it being this terribly generic cover and the paperbacks themselves being very flimsy and cheap feeling, it's just really unattractive looking. And the title is in a brown, and that doesn't look very good against the black background. So I think this is one of the worst looking covers. But frankly, they're all terrible, and most of them use generic stock images, so these are the worst covers the books have ever had, and so this is without question the worst cover for the Spy Who Loved Me novel. And of course, it's the censored altered text, so this should be boycotted and avoided anyway. IFP later did a series of special hardcover editions with new Michael Gillette artwork, so these were sold through IFP's website. I believe they're still available, and they all have the same aesthetic. So you've got white on the top with the credits, and then you've got Michael Gillette artwork across the rest of the cover. So here on Spy, it's a series of broken hearts that are also on fire, and the flames actually go up the cover and cross over into the top white section. So it's a nice, attention-grabbing, solid cover. I just think it doesn't really suggest the book that's inside. But these are very handsome-looking editions, and it makes for a nice matching uniform set. The only problem is these are still the censored altered text, so they are completely worthless, and why IFP thought it was a good idea to make special limited edition hardcovers, obviously geared at James Bond fans and collectors, and still use the altered text is beyond me, because no Bond fan should ever want an altered version of Fleming's work. However, if you want a brand new edition of the book featuring the original unaltered text, there is one version, and it is the true premium collector's version. So these are premium editions from the Folio Society. They all have hard case slip covers, they're all matching hardcover books, and they all feature unbelievably beautiful and strikingly realized artwork by Faye Dalton. So they go together beautifully on a shelf, and here for Spy, the cover is the Dreamy Pines motor court with Bond's car outside, beautifully realized with all sorts of period detail taken directly from Fleming's text. And most importantly, it is Fleming's unaltered original text in all of these. So this is the only in-print version of Fleming's original works, but the problem is these are all premium collector's editions, so on average they're between $75 and $100 each. So it's definitely out of the reach of most Bond fans and collectors, but this is the most premium edition you can get, and the one that we all sort of dream about having a complete set someday, but it's unfortunately out of the reach of most of us price-wise. But this is the edition we sort of aspire to. It's the most premium version, and it's the only version currently available of Fleming's unaltered works. Now I'll go over the editions in my own collection, which aren't many, as Spy had far less printings and editions due to Fleming not wanting it to be republished during his lifetime. So my childhood copy, and still my favorite edition, is my copy of the Signet edition. So this is an earlier printing without the height blurbs, and you've got the classic James Bond thriller down the side, the beautiful sort of mint green color, the yellow of the title, and the wonderful, gorgeous artwork. So this does, of course, obviously have some wear, but it's held up quite well. And of course, you've got the iconic red-edged pages of a Signet paperback. Here is the spine with the title in a nice blue, and then the iconic rear cover of the Signets with the photo of Fleming. And this is a later printing, as it does have Fleming's death date in 1964 listed. As you can see, it's actually a 15th printing. And as you can see, it still contains the 3 parts of the book of me, them, and him. We have the original opening letter conceit where there's a page from Fleming talking directly to the reader, as if suddenly one day he had this story appear on his desk and he just wrote it up into novel form as the recollections of Vivian Michel if she was a real person. And as I mentioned before, the Signet still has the image of the Dreamy Pines. And of course, page 1 with the classic Signet layout, font, and style, but as you can see, there's actual nice extra stylization for the different parts and the actual chapter titles. For fun, here's my copy of the film novelization by Christopher Wood in the style of Ian Fleming. So this has the iconic Bob Peak poster artwork, nicely printed, and this copy is in really good shape, so it has a bit of a gloss finish on it still. Then we have the film font original logo on the spine, and then a nice matching rear cover still with the film font and credits. And then here is the overall layout. And as you can see, interestingly, this was handled by Warner Books, even though it obviously was not a Warner film, it was a UA film. But you can already see in the opening line just how much this book is imitating Fleming directly. And then here is my copy of the 2002 Penguin version with the amazing Richie Fahey artwork. This looks even better in person, and you can just pore over the details. The overall design, the layout, the detail in the artwork, the striving to get a classic pulp fiction cover aesthetic. I mean, it is just masterfully done. And then we have the spine with horror on it as well. And these are not only matching spines with all the others, but it is a wraparound cover. So you've got the same aesthetic for the whole series. You've got the critical blurbs. You got the same image of Bond's gun hand with a quote from the book as you get on all the rear covers, but here it's stylized and unique for this book as Bond's gun hand is coming out of the flames. Then in a beautiful touch, there's Viv once again riding away on her Vespa, as if to also reference the incredible Signet paperback cover. Inside, you've got the stylized photo of Fleming, as in all of these, the 007 logo on the rear, as all the books do. Unfortunately, this doesn't have the image of the Dreamy Pines motor court, nor does it have the note from Fleming to the reader about suddenly finding this on his desk one day. So most editions after the initial printings and early 60s copies did do away with both of those. I think some have the Fleming note, but it's basically hit or miss. But just keep in mind, most editions do lack both the illustration and the note. So I think The Spy Who Loved Me remains a fascinating book. It's an interesting book to return to, as I do think it grows on the reader over the years. Even if it's a book you don't enjoy or you didn't think much of the first time, I think it's important to revisit, and it's also best read as part of the series and where it appears. If you read the Bond books on their own, they're still great, but it's only when you read them in chronological order that you feel the full journey of the books, and you feel where Fleming was going, and you can feel the continuity of the style and how he tried different things, and how the earlier books are different to the middle books, and the middle books are different to the final books. And so you can very much see where Spy fits in between Thunderball and On Her Majesty's Secret Service. And it is important to reread, as there are key elements that do move Bond closer to where he is in OHMSS. So it's important for Bond's character as well, even though he's not the main character of the book. I do agree this book was a bold experiment. I do agree it's not entirely successful, but I do think it's a very striking book, and I do basically give it quite a bit of leeway because it is such a bold departure, and Fleming was really trying to do something completely different. And it also shows that it's the more experimental Fleming of Quantum of Solace and some of the short stories, and I really love what he did in those, and you feel that continuing here. I wish certain elements were maybe a little bit more polished, and I do wish the plot of the final act in particular didn't feel so simplistic and sort of taken out of direct pulp thriller elements. But again, that's what this story would have to wind up being in terms of it's a particular type of story that's going to end in one particular way. So I guess if anything, I wish Fleming had not had Bond make so many mistakes in the final act, one after another. And most of all, I wish I could tell Fleming that the one line is a bad idea and at least change the wording or something, because it's not a good idea. So yeah, I always find myself coming back to the one line, because outside of that and my issues with the greater simplicity of the final third act, I do think this is a remarkable book, and I do think Vivian is a really wonderful character to follow around, and I think the reader does genuinely feel sympathy for her, and there is great suspense in the book. In fact, the most suspense, I think, is actually in the second act before Bond enters the book, and you then could make the argument that if this was a story entirely about Vivian and James Bond never enters the story, that it may have been an even more successful book in terms of it being a pure suspense thriller of a woman in over her head and trying to survive and having to rely only on her wits and nothing else, and no savior figure comes in out of nowhere to rescue her. And it also would have been a complete experiment then, because there would be no James Bond to fall back on. But I don't know if Fleming at the time felt he could do a novel that wasn't a James Bond book, or if his publisher was even interested in a non-James Bond novel. I mean, you've got The Diamond Smugglers and Thrilling Cities, but those were developed out of pieces that he had done for newspapers and journal publications about real-world events, or actually traveling the world and talking about the experience in different cities. So I don't think that was possible to do with Spy, but there is an argument to be made that it might have been a more successful book in certain areas had it not featured James Bond at all and just been a pure out-and-out suspense thriller about a woman being stalked by two killers in a deserted motel in upstate New York. Ultimately, I do think it's a quite remarkable book. It does have its shortcomings, but I think you do have to give it some slack because it's Fleming really working outside of his comfort zone. There is important material and bits of characterization and elements that do enrich the rest of the Bond novels in the world of James Bond and show the character at a particular place in time. So it has a bit of that outsider looking in aesthetic that we got in some of the short stories in For Your Eyes Only. So I think it's important as a book in the James Bond canon for a number of reasons. I don't think it needs to be overlooked or derided like it usually is. It is the most underrated and undervalued book that Fleming ever wrote, and easily the most undervalued James Bond novel, and that's because it's not strictly a James Bond novel, and it is so experimental. So there is some baggage that comes along with that. And it's obviously not going to be a book for everyone, but I think it does need to be properly examined and analyzed as part of the James Bond canon and examined for what Fleming did well in this experiment and, certain elements that may have not been so well done or well handled. So it has its pluses and minuses, but I do think overall it's quite remarkable that Fleming even tried something like this, and it's still a good book filled with Fleming's inimitable writing style, but through a different lens, essentially. So those are my thoughts on The Spy Who Loved Me, rereading it for the umpteenth time. As always, I hope my babblings about the world of James Bond and the incredible works of Ian Fleming have been at least somewhat fun and informative. And so until I return with my next video on Her Majesty's Secret Service, I just want to say please do keep supporting your local independent bookstores by hopefully being able to find some lovely vintage Fleming editions for your collection. Keep reading, keep bonding, and thank you ever so much for watching.